Like Steve Perry, my parents divorced when I was very, very young. And there's a certain trauma that occurs in a child when their parents are divorced. I don't know how that trauma varies from child to child, but Steve Perry has spoken about this, how much it affected him. And, he talks about how children have the tendency to blame themselves and how he sort of blamed himself. I don't know if I did that. I honestly haven't really thought much about it until I started really thinking about going back and reflecting on my favorite Journey songs, and in particular the song Lights, which they played here at this concert. This was, I guess, their last concert they ever did with Steve Perry. It was very short, just a couple songs at a Bill Graham Memorial Concert, which you can find there on YouTube easily enough. And so the song Lights, I only have a handful of memories, just very dim glimmers of memories from before my parents' divorce, because I was only, I think, five or six. And there was a brief window where I can recall feeling that everything was at ease and everything was good in the world and there was comfort at home. And that may or may not have been the actual case, but my memory tells me that. My memory brings a feeling of warmth as I step inside, my child body and look out into the world. The song Lights literally brings me, it's like a 3D photograph that takes me into that moment as a child where everything else is just completely blurred out and cloudy, but that one memory is there. So, there's something very special about that song to me personally, as cheesy and, kind of shamelessly nostalgic as that sounds. And in fact, I think that was a criticism leveled at Journey at one point, shamelessly nostalgic. And Steve Perry laughed and he said, I love that. In a interview from a few years ago, which we will look at in a moment. Journey songs have really ingrained themselves in American culture, especially, Don't Stop Believin'. I still see, at karaoke bars singing these songs. They play the songs at the games, the sports games, and the Journey songs remain fairly timeless. They're very kind of cheesy in the 80s, late 70s arena rock kind of way, but they've shown themselves to be kind of timeless, and I think it has to do with the emotional delivery of Steve Perry. I think everybody knows that. And, as I've gotten older and I've looked into the darker side of the music industry, I go back and I revisit, these bands and songs and artists, and I compare the way that I saw them when I was young and naive to my more cynical eye these days, where it's hard for me to believe anyone is untainted. I look at Steve Perry and I think this guy's basically an angel. He's going out there and, he's genuinely delivering something emotional to people and telling them don't stop believing, and they're getting inspired by it. And, it's unfortunate that I don't hear a lot of God mentioned anywhere in there, but I mean, at least he's delivering a positive message and it's reaching a lot of people even. So I don't want to knock anything about what the guy does artistically. I think he's, pretty much as flawless as you can get. And he seems like a really kind, wonderful, decent person. But again, we don't know these people. I mean, we judge them according to their songs and their music and their performance. And we like to think that's who they actually are underneath. But, they're human beings, and human beings all have flaws. Nobody's perfect. And I found out some things about Steve Perry that I didn't know about previously. Nothing really groundbreaking or anything. I just simply never sat down and went, well, what the hell happened to him all those years that he left Journey and he was completely silent? I mean, what was that all about? And so all I really did was look into that, and I'm just going to briefly go over my findings here. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the main guitarist in Journey, Neil Schon, he was actually in Santana before he was in Journey in like the late 60s, early 70s. And he was like 15 years old. I think he even played at Woodstock with Santana. So Neil Schon was already in the industry. He was like a child prodigy. He was big stuff. So when Journey first formed, like in 75 or whatever it was, they were like a jazz fusion band. And they didn't sound like the way they do now. They were more closer to like something like prog rock or, more jazzy. And I guess their first debut album did okay, but then the second and third albums did progressively worse. And Journey was managed by a guy named Herbie Herbert II, I think. And this guy was kind of like a big time manager guy, and he was friends with Billy Graham. Billy Graham booked a lot of the bands in the 60s in the San Francisco hippie era. So Billy Graham was, he was big stuff because, as we saw earlier, Journey was playing a tribute concert to him when he died in the park in Golden Gate Park there in San Francisco. So there was big people behind the formation of Journey. And so when they weren't that successful, I guess they decided they needed to do something more commercially viable. Because going from prog rock to like arena rock, and then the big hair rock like Scorpions and things like that, the Journey was kind of a pivotal point to where that change was happening. So while Journey was playing prog rock, Steve Perry was in this band called the Alien Project, which sounded a lot more like Journey. It was like kind of big, powerful rock songs where his voice was just soaring on top. And, if someone told you this is an early Journey song, you'd probably believe them. It sounded that much like Journey, which is kind of interesting. Kind of reminds me of Queensryche. Jeff Tate, if you go back to before Queensryche, and, Queensryche formed in like 1982. Jeff Tate was already doing that style of music, kind of progressive metal. Even more progressive than what Queensryche was doing in 1982. Jeff Tate was already doing that in his previous band. I think they're called Myth or something. And even some of the same song titles. I think Lady Wore Black was a title he brought with him pre-Queensryche. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is Journey didn't just pop out of nowhere. I mean, these were significant characters. Steve Perry, his father owned like a radio station, KNGS, that I think played like Portuguese music or something. Anyway, these guys were sort of in the industry already. So I just think that's an important point because it shows you what goes into, these big established bands we know of. They're not necessarily rags to riches stories, although I'm sure there are a lot of rags in there. Apparently the bass player for this band, Alien Project, Richard Michaels, who it's hard to find much out about that guy. He was killed in a car accident on July 4th, 1977, just as the band was getting signed. I forget which record label. So I guess that freaked out Steve Perry to the point where he wanted to quit music. But then he got a call from the manager, Herbie Herbert, of Nightmare Productions. He was the one that managed Santana and then Journey. He seemed to be the mind behind creating Journey and putting Neil Schon in there. He found Steve Perry, I guess, just at the nick of time when someone happened to die in his band and he was looking to quit, the industry altogether. Coincidence? Kind of interesting. So they heard this song, which is, you can find this on YouTube, If You Need Me, Call Me, which is kind of funny when you think about the name of the song. It's called If You Need Me, Call Me. It's like, okay, they needed him, so they called him. And that's how he got in the band. And there he is with Neil Schon there. And then I guess he changed his mind and decided he wanted to do this. He didn't want to quit the music industry after all. Now back in 2019, Steve Perry gave what seems to be his longest, deepest interview about all the years he wasn't in Journey, which we'll talk more about in a minute. He talks about all the stuff that the fans have sort of been like, well, what about this and what about that? He covers everything in this interview. And he covers some of his childhood trauma, which includes when his parents got divorced. And it's interesting when you watch interviews of Steve Perry. He conjures up a lot of the emotion you get when you listen to the music. It's almost like he has this gift to move people, to move them to emotion. And this is something that gets exploited by the music industry for the obvious reason that when you can move, they say music soothes the savage beast. Well, it can also stir the savage beast. And I think that, the powerful people in charge of our countries and this world, they've noticed what music does to people. And so they noticed, probably around the time of the British invasion, or probably a little earlier, that you've got to be able to control the music and even the individuals in there, or at least make sure you control who's in there and who isn't, so that you can move people the right way, the way you want them to go with your political plan or whatever else you have going on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual artists are even aware of that they're being used. But I think the high percentage of them are, and I think as time goes on, the percentage of artists that know they're being used continues to go up, which is why they need less and less intelligent and self-aware artists in the popular realm, because you need people that aren't that self-aware, so they don't wake up and realize how much they're being manipulated and how much they're being used to manipulate you and me. Anyway, so Steve Perry discusses, the divorce in his family and how that sort of seems like it was the first big trauma in his life. And he talks about how affected he was by it, and how he dove himself into music. That was his escape. And, I'm sure a lot of you can relate. I can certainly relate to that. I didn't have the greatest childhood, and some of my best memories are diving into music and just immersing myself in the imaginary world of whatever song I was hearing on the radio, which is why we develop these, what we believe are relationships almost with these songs and these people that do the songs. And I think The Who was one of the first bands to really sort of make a science out of all that and exploit the relationship between the band and the audience. But it's so easy to digress here, because we get into so many other areas that I cover all the time when we talk about Journey here. But anyway, there's another trauma that Steve Perry mentions here, which I don't recall ever hearing before, which is, he said a violation occurred when he was a kid. I assume around, 10 or 11, 12. He may say right here when it happens. He doesn't give any detail, but, violation sounds to me like sexual abuse. That's what it sounds like to me. And again, it sounds like he sort of bounces back by diving deeper into the music. And it's just weird. You find these traumas, these childhood traumas with a lot of these famous rock stars, from Chester Bennington to like Phil Anselmo, any number of musicians. And you start thinking that this is really common. Maybe this is a lot more common than we think. But he bounces back, eventually ends up in the Alien Project, and then boom, his bass player dies. Another trauma. Some of you might remember this artist called Cyclops. I sort of vaguely remember this a little bit. I didn't know what it was, but this is actually Herbie Herbert II. This was Journey's manager. And this is the guy I mentioned earlier, who was managing, Santana when Neil Schon was in it. He was Billy Graham's protege. He was also friends with one of the guys in the Grateful Dead. So he has ties to that whole kind of 60s thing, 60s San Francisco hippie movement. And first of all, Cyclops, you can observe the iconography right here. The eyeball with the wings, I believe Grateful Dead used that. The Residents used that a lot. The whole third eye thing gets into kind of like the occult symbolism, Cyclops, sort of misspelling it. And this is like his alter ego. And right away we get themes of, like kind of mind control, MK Ultra stuff. And I guess he did, under the name Cyclops, he did an album with some of the guys from Journey. And it was called Trichromes. And look at that, it's got a pyramid right on the front. And Tri, T-R-I, reminds me kind of like the Reich Corporation, Queensryche's Corporation. And this thunderbolt is popular with Freemasonic, imagery. You think of fire, light, lightning, the light coming from the top of the pyramid. This symbol's a little funky because some of you might remember a few years back, the FBI released these symbols that are supposedly covert pedophile symbols. I'm not saying these guys are pedophiles because of this, but I just can't help but notice this symbol here looks like the lines are going towards the right, whereas this one's going towards the left. So it could just be a coincidence. They may not be boy lovers, but then you've got this symbol as well. Little boy lover. And that kind of looks like it a little bit there, but it also looks like a G. So G inside of an eyeball kind of reminds you of the G inside of the square and compass, which some say stands for God or geometry, or, you know, I tend to go with the generative force, which I've spoken about in other blogs, the generative force in nature. If you read Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike, the whole first section is all about the force. And, you know, the lightning bolt connects with that logic. There's another lightning bolt, looks like behind the skull there. It's kind of small. Anyway, it's no surprise you've got this sort of Illuminati kind of symbolism, occult themes going on with the management behind Journey. And so I sort of picture Neil Schon and Steve Perry and all these other musicians. They're just sort of pawns in the game of whatever these manager types have going on. They might be witting participants, unwitting, but it's just when you consider all the trauma a lot of these artists experience, I think it's important to look at who's behind them and the bigger picture. And it looks like in 1986, when the band was recording Raised on Radio, Steve Perry's mother became ill and died during the production of the album. And I guess this was really traumatic for Perry. I don't know that his father was still alive. I think his father was already gone maybe, but I guess he was really close to his mother because this really screwed him up and he wasn't able to go back to the band. He ended up going on hiatus after the tour. He did the tour in 87 and then he goes on hiatus. Throughout the interview and throughout a lot of interviews, there's like a haunting, almost like a fear that it's almost kind of palpable in Steve Perry. And I don't know if that's from the trauma he experienced as a youngster or if some things happened along the way that we don't know about, or maybe just the weight of being who he is. Just, you know, he's a human being and trying to fulfill the role of one of the most well-known rock stars on the planet, and it's just a heavy weight. And maybe he's just a human being that is struggling holding that weight and trying to reach a balance. But while he's, you know, quote unquote gone and everyone's going, where's Steve Perry? He's not really completely gone. In April of 1989, he got on stage in an arena and sang a couple songs with Bon Jovi. The Journey reunion thing in 1991 that we saw the video of. Anyway, so as the story goes, Steve Perry calls up Journey one day and decides he wants to do it again. This after he sort of told them he never wants to, he's quitting the business. He's out, he's done, he's burnt out. He calls them. But it seems like part of the condition of Perry getting back in the band is he wants Herbert to be replaced due to personality conflicts. So again, Herbert was very powerful. He was the guy who seems like brought the guys together in the beginning. So I would imagine that the drama behind the scenes of Steve Perry wanting Herbert to leave and get replaced, there's probably a huge story behind that that's never been told. Or maybe it's out there and I've just never seen it. I'm only revisiting Steve Perry here in the past couple weeks. I haven't really looked into any of this before. So someone out there may say, oh, it's very obvious what happened there. But anyway, you know, Journey already has their fame and fortune at this point. And so I guess if Steve Perry's going to bother doing it, he's going to want to do it on his own terms. And he understands that he's the guy everyone wants. So I'm sure that, you know, he knew the power that he wielded and he wasn't afraid to wield it sometimes. As unassuming as he appears in a lot of these interviews. As I said, the story goes that he was the one who called Journey and wanted to collaborate again. So I guess that culminated in the album Trial by Fire, which was recorded in 1995 or 96. And by this time, their former manager Herbert is doing Cyclops and collaborating with other Journey members. So clearly the other members of Journey did not have a falling out with that manager. It was Steve Perry who seemed to have a problem with that guy. And then before the band can tour for Trial by Fire in 96, which was a very successful album apparently, Steve Perry gets a hip injury. And he's told that he needs to get hip surgery, but he doesn't want to get hip surgery. He keeps putting it off. And a couple years go by, and in 1998, the band's like, dude, you've got to do something here. You've got to get your hip fixed, or we've got to move on or something. And then Steve Perry gets really offended because they're talking about maybe getting another singer. He gets very offended, and he quits, quote unquote, permanently. So you can imagine the kind of fit he threw there. So here's where Steve Perry seems to take a huge break. He puts out a greatest hits album. He does the Hollywood Walk of Fame ceremony in 2005 with the group, remasters some of his solo albums, but overall there's not a lot going on between 96 and 2011 when he meets Kelly Nash, a psychologist and cancer survivor. And here's where I sort of have a question. So this guy was I'm sure had women throwing themselves at him left and right, but yet we don't ever hear about girlfriends or kids other than Sherry. Oh, Sherry. And we find out in this interview here that he actually has a child, but he's been keeping the child and the wife, I guess, hidden from the public, I guess for their protection. And in one sense, I'm going, well, okay, he's a very private guy, and some famous people are more private than others, and he's one that just wants to protect them from, his world, his circus of rock stardom, I suppose. But I get kind of the feeling there's something else he wants to protect them from, almost like, a guy who's being hunted and doesn't want, anyone to know who his family is because he doesn't want them to be unsafe or get known. There's just this real paranoid fear I get behind Steve Perry's eyes. And I just wonder if that's some nefarious aspect of the entertainment industry, which would be perfectly believable. And it's not something he'd be able to just blurt out in the open. So, I just wonder if this accounts for some of the mystery about this musician and others. Where there's just this impenetrable wall where we just don't know what's going on. And it might be something very basic and as human as, there are nefarious forces back here. And I can't tell you about them, but, I've got to deal with them, and I've got to balance dealing with you, the public, and dealing with them and making everyone happy if I can. So anyway, his relationship with Kelly Nash seems to be very public because it's wrapped up in this story about I think Steve Perry or a Journey song was going to be used for the music for the movie Monster, which was a pretty big movie. And Kelly Nash was in some cancer awareness group that got associated with that. And Steve Perry saw her in some video and he instantly fell in love with her. It seemed like it was love at first sight. And the thing about cancer survivors is that there's always the worry that cancer can come back. So I think it's important to point out that, when you're falling in love with someone who's a cancer survivor, there's a part of you that's got to know it might come back and you might lose that person. Now, I'm not an expert on cancer. I haven't known a lot of people who've had it. Actually, I know two people, and both of those people I know are constantly having some kind of medical issue. Sometimes they have long bouts where there's not a lot going on, but then they'll have health issues in succession. So, cancer isn't something that always just goes away. So I just find it, strange that he happens to fall in love with this woman who may not necessarily have that long to live. And she tells him as much in so many words, and he reveals in this interview that she confronted him one day and said, hey, just make me a promise that if I'm not around much longer, that you won't go into hiding and you won't go, hiding away again. And Steve Perry tells this story as if it's completely left field. But again, that's cancer. You may recover, but it may come back. And he acts like it's such a shock. And maybe that's because he was so in love with her and their relationship was so strong. But they were only together like a year and a half. They weren't together that long. And maybe I've just never met my soulmate yet, and maybe I just don't know what it's like to meet your soulmate and only be together for a year and a half, and have the kind of connection that he seemed to have with this woman. Or maybe it's an age thing. But I just, it's hard for me to believe that he was so taken by this woman, having only known her for a short period. But what do I know? I'm not Steve Perry, you know. Who can know what it's like to stand in someone else's shoes? Anyway, apparently she also told him at some point, you know, when some fans came up and took a picture with him, and they were all excited and they were shaking, and she told him, according to Steve Perry, you know, Kelly Nash told him, you see what you do to people? That tells you that that's what you have to be doing on this planet. You know, and again, it's too bad that God never enters the equation here. I mean, maybe Steve Perry's believes in God and he just doesn't want to talk about it because he doesn't want to alienate people, and that's fine. But I don't hear God come up anywhere. And so, according to Steve Perry, all the music he's doing now, at least this is what I read into his interviews and what he's said in various quotations, is that the only reason he's even out here doing music anymore is to keep that promise to Nash that he wouldn't go back into hiding. And, you know, obviously that's very heavy when you think about it, because it sort of insinuates that there's something pulling him out all the time, that he's still feeling that pull. What is that pull is my question. And how do we account for these contradictions where he says things like, you know, the Journey songs are my babies, and separating from Journey was like a divorce. And, you know, how do we reconcile him saying he can't play music anymore, and then years later him being the one who initiates, like, I've got to have my band back, Journey, you know? So anyhow, he put out this album, Traces, in 2018, and I think that was the last thing he did. He's put out various Christmas albums, which is kind of interesting, because it makes me wonder, oh, maybe he is a Christian. You know, he's got, like, I think his third Christmas project that he's working on, I think right now, or maybe it came out and I missed it. But that's kind of interesting. Mr. Cyclops Herbie Herbert died, and he's someone I think I might want to do a blog about sometime. He seems like a very interesting individual that kind of went under my radar. So if you've seen a lot of my videos, you know that I like to sort of wrap things up and give my theories about what I think. And with Steve Perry, I'm going to kind of leave that alone a little bit, because I really feel like Steve Perry is a good guy who's probably stuck in a place where he's dealt with some evil things. And I just think that's true for every, you know, major, anyone who gets a lot of fame. They deal with a lot of evil, and they deal with it in different ways, and maybe they give into the evils at times, or but I don't know. Steve Perry strikes me as someone who's probably seen some horrible things and probably had to do some horrible things, but ultimately is trying to be a good person as best he can. You know, the idea of sacrifice is always on the table. I think that all these artists have to do it at some point, whether it's their own soul or someone else. And I hate to give into confirmation bias here. But again, you know, that's why I'm trying not to stretch things and connect dots too strongly that I don't feel strongly enough to utter out loud. But I just thought this was an interesting little thing to dig into and perhaps come back to at a later date. I've been mentioning that I have a Rumble page for some time now, and I always put a link to my Rumble page in every video, including this one. And I'm hoping to get to encourage some of you to go over there more. And so I came up with an idea to put exclusive content over there. So I went ahead and recorded a song, just a short song of me singing along the lines of the stuff I talk about here. And I created a new channel on this Rumble page called Joe Gilmore Sings. So I'm going to periodically upload songs, short little tunes, and check it out. Let me know what you think of it, and I hope you like it. Again, you won't find this on YouTube. I'm only putting this exclusively on Rumble.